Hello. So if you're anything like me, then when some kind of dramatic thing happens in the world, you can't wait to run to Google and type whatever that thing is, plus Nostradamus, into your browser and discover, shockingly, how Nostradamus predicted literally every bad thing that's ever happened in the history of the world. So, just kind of a little morbid curiosity for me. Um, what am I talking about? And what is this video going to be about? Oh my god. The, the reason I do that is because I have kind of a little love affair with morbid curiosity. I think as most humans do. And it kind of cracks me up how internet trolls, from the beginning of the internet really, and trolls from the beginning of time, have managed to take the nebulous quatrains written by one Nostradamus and twist them, rewrite them, and even create them from scratch to predict every horrible thing that's ever happened. And, I mean, some of them, as written, have been used to predict bad things. And the thing that always makes me laugh is that I think Nostradamus was probably the worst fortune teller in the history of the world. Because even if he was right about any of that shit, it was totally useless information. And so vague, so nonspecific, so imprecise that it's been used to terrify children and the vulnerable from the beginning of time. But as a snarky and somewhat curious human being, I always get tickled by how every time something bad happens, there's something really comforting, I think, about the predictability of the internet to do what it does sometimes. And sometimes it's really discomforting. But that's just sort of like a little bizarre. I mean, it never fails. And I do find that sort of weirdly relaxing to know. But it did get me thinking this morning, and even last night, about, can and should such things be predicted? And what about on a more macro level? Can and should gloom and doom be predicted in a regular everyday reading? And I'm sure this is going to come as a shock to you, but I have thoughts on all of those things. So buckle up. So let's begin with the idea of predicting major world events. I've done this video 3 times and tried to think of a different example that's less kind of but it is a precise one, and precision is important. So after September 11th, 2001, I remember in a lot of tarot forums, folks, including me, saying, wow, I'd been getting the tower a lot in the days and weeks leading up to that event. I wonder if that was like a sign, and I should have seen the signs. And that's kind of a very delightfully human and naive thing to think and wonder. And it also borders on arrogant a little bit, I'll admit. And the reason that I say that is because, of course it wasn't. I mean, look, it may have been talking about the impacts of how life would change, but that event is such a specific thing and kind of so once in a lifetime that I don't think there's a combination of cards that could have told anyone that very thing. And if it had, and someone had said something, they would have been laughed out of the room or like arrested for spreading fear. It's like yelling fire in a theater. You know what I mean? So, I struggle because I think it's a very human thing to say, like, oh, what if we had known? I mean, that's what governments are for, and I'm not even going to go down that road. Shit, but you know what I mean? Like, I don't think there's a way that could have been predicted in a tarot reading, and I don't think what we're living through now could have been predicted in a tarot reading. And I think if it had been, like a Nostradamus prediction, would it have been specific enough to have made sense? And would it have been useful enough to have impacted anything? And I think the answer to both of those things is no, it wouldn't have. It couldn't have been that specific, and it wouldn't have changed anything. All it would have done was maybe made the reader feel good about their psychic prowess, or terrify someone. And so I think in that case, it's like, who would have imagined things would have gotten this way? Now, this is a situation where there were signs that it could happen. So maybe a reader could have said, well, how big is this going to get? And a reading could have explored that. But to predict it prior to that knowledge, prior to that context, I think would have been impossible, truly. And it comes down to me too, to like, would it have been useful? You know, who would it have helped? I don't know. I mean, maybe people who are, you know, obsessed with preparedness. But we've also seen how sort of self-indulgent preparedness has really hurt a lot of folks. And so I don't think that would have been useful either. So, but you know, this sort of macro of world events sort of transitions into something smaller, which is like the one-on-one reading for yourself or a client or a querent or whoever. And, you know, what about predicting bad things or gloom and doom? Is it ethical? Is it possible? Is it reasonable? And who does it help? And so I think it's worth this. You know, again, this may not be a video everyone wants to watch right now, and that's totally fine. But I do think that as a responsible reader, particularly if you're going pro, if that's an ambition of yours, you do need to kind of know what and how to handle this responsibly. And there are many different schools of thought on this. I'll get to mine in a second. I'll illustrate, I think, the struggle with an example and why specificity is important, and you know, that actions have consequences. So I was told a story by a friend of mine, or I guess I should say a friend of mine told me a story about a reader who believes that they predicted someone else's death in a reading for that person. So it was like a client reading, they were face to face, and this reader believes that she saw that this person was going to die, and that person later did. And the reader was really torn up about it because they wondered, if I had said something, could it have been prevented? But as I understand it, the person who ultimately died in a very unpredictable and unavoidable way. And so, no, there may not have been. Now, I don't know what kinds of combinations of cards would tell me something like that. But I know that a lot of people have had experiences like this as readers and as clients. I mean, I've talked about this, I think, before, but my mother hates all of this tarot stuff. And in part, I think it's because that when she was younger, a tarot reader supposedly predicted her father's death. And obviously, that would have been terrifying, and he did pass at a young age of a heart attack. And I just sort of resent that reader in a lot of ways, because I don't know that what they did was the right thing, even if they ended up being right, because it didn't change the outcome, and all it did was terrify my mother. And I think it's a really irresponsible thing to use something like that to make people's lives worse. And so I guess where I come down on this is that the ultimate responsibility, you know, there are folks who will say the ultimate responsibility of a reader is to tell the truth. I think that it is one of the responsibilities. But I also think that the ultimate responsibility is to do no harm, and to be thoughtful, and to take care of the person you're reading for. And so if you're encountering a situation where you feel like you have to deliver bad news, you feel like the news is going to be awful, and you don't know what to do, there are a series of things I suppose I would say in that case. And I would begin with how sure you think you are, and to always reduce that confidence exponentially just out of safety. You know, I would say if I were certain, I would say, okay, let me like reduce that certainty to 50% of that just to be more realistic, because you want to think critically. I think you want to think about whether or not it's useful information, meaning, can anything be helped? Can sharing this information change things? And if yes, then I would think more like a teacher, a mentor, rather than a predictor. What I would do in that case, and what I think predictive readings can be very good at, is sharing risk factors. You know, if I go to a nutritionist and the nutritionist is pretty certain that I'm well past the point of being able to fix years of bad eating habits, they could say to me that there's nothing I can do at this point. And so I get to live out my life hopelessly. Or they could say, well, here are the risk factors, and here are how those risk factors are mitigated. Will that change the course? Probably not. Maybe. Who knows? But it puts me in a position... Sorry, the camera... It puts me in a position to at least have hope, which is maybe the most generous and thoughtful thing you can give me at that point. You know, we're not doctors, we're not counselors, we're not trained to do this stuff. And I think it's really important that we recognize that. And that to put someone in a position that may require a counselor or a doctor is a really risky thing to do. And so maybe the most generous thing to do is to recommend seeking professional help at that point. If nothing can be done, and if you don't see any out, then I think you have a responsibility to not destroy that person, and to be kind and to care for them, and maybe telling them the truth is not the right thing to do in that case. Again, like I really cannot and have not been in a position where this has happened to me, but I think about it a lot because who knows? I do not think that readings tend to go that way unless the question warrants it. You know what I mean? Unless the question is about gloom and doom. And I also have to say that so many things in life are so dependent on unpredictable patterns, which we can see as we watch the scientists trying to figure out, for example, where we are now and how things work with this particular pandemic, for example. They don't know yet because that's unpredictable. And so to do a reading about this, for example, would be very difficult because even the patterns itself aren't fully formed. So would it help to tell the truth? Is it going to destroy them for no reason? What's the impact on you if you say it and you're wrong? You know what I mean? Like, we do have to consider the fact that we are not always right. And I don't tend to trust readers who say they always are. Now, that's not to say that I don't think that such things can show up in readings. What I do know, and what I have seen, is that we may do a predictive reading about something, and the impacts of a big event may show up, but not the event itself. Because, and this is one reason why I say questions are so important, because what it does is it gives you a bounding box. The cards are always going to answer that question. And so if you're focusing on that, it really does tune out distractions and like weirdnesses that might make you think, oh. You know, I mean, for example, if we think about the world as it is right now, if an actor had come to me and said, oh, I'm up for this big gig, it could be my Broadway debut, it's like a really good job, am I going to get the job and will it be a success? You know what I mean? Like a reading could say, yeah, you're going to get the job, and no, it's not going to be a success. And it's got nothing to do with the actor. They might get the job, but the world is such now that theaters are closed. So the show may never go on, as it were. And so like the impacts of events, I think, can show up in readings. And it is helpful to remember as readers that there are things that are out of our control. You know, I mean, that is something that's interesting about the modern tarot renaissance, is that it has become, I think, so much about self-empowerment that to a degree we get lost in that, and we forget that there are things that have impacts on our lives that we cannot see and that are going to take away our agency sometimes, and one of my favorite spreads that I offer comes from Benabel Wen's Holistic Tarot, and it's a choice spread. And one of the reasons why I like it so much is that there's, two positions for choices, like situation, advice, but there's also a position in the spread for things that are out of your control. And I think it's really grounded and really earthy and really thoughtful to have a position in reading that says, okay, yes, you may have all the agency you think you do, you may be making the right decisions, but what's not in your control? What are the things that are just going to be an obstacle no matter what? Or the things that maybe like a headwind or maybe like a tailwind, things that might be helping you or things that might be keeping you from getting where you want to go. We are not, as much as we like to think about it, we do not live as islands. We are not isolated from the actions of others, the acts of others, world events, etc. And so I think a thing that is useful in readings is to have a little underline somewhere that says, well, what is out of your control? Especially if it's like, can I, should I, will I kind of thing. What can I do to get this job is a question we might ask. And so we could do that. We could also say, what's out of your control that you should be aware of as you go through this? Because I think a realistic reading will take into account that not everything is empowered. We don't always have agency in every situation. I'm just looking at little sketches of notes that I made. I think it's important for us as readers to remember, but not get terrified by the fact that every action has a consequence. And so when we do read for people, whether we're giving them good news or bad news, there is going to be a consequence to saying that. And I think it's helpful not to get hung up on that, but just to know. And if we are in a position where we're giving potentially really bad, and I don't mean like, no, you're not going to get the job, or no, this relationship is going to work out. I mean like the kind of heavy stuff that we're seeing. My ultimate responsibility is to the humanity of the person in front of me, or on the video or whatever. And I have to know in advance as a reader and be prepared for being able to handle that humanity and care for that humanity. It doesn't mean lying. It doesn't mean telling falsehoods or negating our power, whatever, however you want to think about it. It means that ultimately this is a human act. And I think we have a responsibility to do the most humane thing. And if the most humane thing to say is, hey, I see some real risk factors in here for you, and I really, really want to encourage you to go to a doctor, go to a counselor, whatever, seek financial aid. Like, that is a very humane thing to do. On the other hand, if what you see is fatalism, and you say, look, nothing you can do, you're going to be dead by the end of the year, sorry, that's kind of garbage and not humane, and I think that's bad reading. In the very first book I ever read on tarot, there was a question about, like, what's my responsibility if I see something like that in a reading, and what should I do? And the writer said, you should do nothing, because there's nothing helpful about giving someone fatalistic news. You see what you see, you give them the answer that you can give them, and that's it. And that's a side effect of doing what we do. It's a hard topic to talk about right now, but I think it's a good topic to talk about right now because it's on people's minds. I think, the other thing I want to say too, I guess, is like the party game aspect of things. I just think, like, as a responsible reader, I would never play the party game of like, who is going to die first or when you're going to die, or, how bad will this pandemic get, for example. Like, I feel like that is not helpful reading. And maybe it's possible to get answers. I mean, certainly there's a whole historical, anthropological thing you could do about party games and divination and how that was really, really common. But I think there's a difference if we are building a practice, rather than just being someone who pulls out the cards at parties for friends, is that there's a responsibility we take to sort of not be frivolous in a bad way. I think that this is a game in a way, and that's kind of fun, and I like that it's a game. But I think if we're going to build our practice around it, it's important to not kind of play that kind of game for folks. And I don't know anyone that would, but I think it's important to just sort of like be respectful about your talent or your gift, if you want to call it that way. So, but I mean, that being said, it's certainly not uncommon in the history of the world. I mean, divination party games like that were super popular. I just, I'm not a magician. I'm not a party entertainer. I'm a fortune teller. I'm a card slinger. It's a different thing. It's a subtle thing, but it's a different thing. So anyway, kind of a serious topic, I guess, but I think it is something that readers need to think about, consider, and live with, and explore, and sort of prepare yourself if that happens. I don't anticipate having a reading like that anytime soon, because I really do encourage people to have a specific question, and I believe that the cards drawn answer the question, and I think that's that. And yet, life is unpredictable in many ways too, and it's something that readers, we have to remember. As predictors, some things are unpredictable. So being prepared to answer a question like that, or to deal with something that you see like that, I think is wise. So hope this, as always, was interesting. Hopefully not too grim. I hope it was helpful. There are going to be, strong opinions about this. Like, I don't have any problem with you voicing your opinion about it, as long as it's respectful. Because I don't fucking have the energy for, I never have the energy for bullshit, but I don't have the energy for bullshit, especially right now. So take that. So be well, stay safe, stay healthy. If you're not healthy, we're pulling for you. Do the things that are healthy, and we'll talk soon. Okay? Be good.